Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks, Don, and welcome everyone to our continuing series of Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions on the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. Joining me today is Harvey Rishikof. I want to mention to the audience that we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the Defense Industrial Base. Our focus as a managed service provider is primarily on organizations seeking certification, and that's mostly who we have in our audience today. If you are in the audience and you have a question, please send them in on the Q&A feature within Zoom, and I will work as many of those questions in as I can in our discussion today with Harvey. I'll start with an introduction. Harvey Rishikof is the Director of Policy and Cybersecurity Research at the University of Maryland's Applied Research Laboratory for Intelligence and Security. He's a visiting professor of law at Temple Law School, and he's chair of the ABA Advisory Committee to the Standing Committee on Law and National Security. Harvey's been involved in a number of legal policy projects sponsored by the likes of MITRE, the MacArthur Foundation, the Center for Strategic International Studies, the Hewlett Foundation, the Congressional Solarium Project, the National Science Foundation, and the National Academy of Sciences. He specializes in national security, civil and military courts, terrorism, international law, civil liberties, and constitutional law. Harvey, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ed. I appreciate it very much. And I'm here in my personal capacity. I'm not representing any of my formal organizations, but I'm very pleased and very happy to be with you guys because I think you're doing a great job and get a lot of excellent information out there.
Well, thanks, Harvey. As I mentioned, our audience today is mostly organizations seeking certification under the CMMC initiative. So these are primarily government contractors that want to get cyber right. On this series, we spent quite a bit of our time looking at the details of CMMC and how companies should be reacting to it. But I think we all recognize that there's more to good cyber than just navigating the nits of the CMMC standard. So it's really exciting to have you here today to take a bit of a deeper look at some issues of risk, maybe beyond the boundaries of what the CMMC is calling for us to do. Things about supply chain risk, insider risk, other cyber risks that we face. So eager to dive into it.
Okay. Do you want me to go forward, Ed, or like you have a question, or should I just do it?
I'll put some questions up. Let's start with supply chain risk. So that's been top of mind lately. We've got a lot of news around a SolarWinds hack. Vendor provided software updates to COTS products that we use are something that we download and install without really any scrutiny, right? This is just something that we collectively all seem to trust implicitly, or at least we did trust it implicitly until mid-December. So this is a sort of attack that really shakes, our trust foundation. It's not that the issue of supply chain risk is really new, but SolarWinds makes it seem like maybe it's a harder problem, maybe a more pervasive problem than we might have realized. What's your thought on how we should be reacting? How do we regain our faith in the software supply chain?
Ed, it's a great question, and there's been two recent events that speak to it. As you know, it's my understanding President Biden will be executing an executive order on supply chains this afternoon. And the drafts make it sort of interesting that this is going to be a high priority for this administration. And two, we had a congressional hearing yesterday on SolarWinds with Mandiant and Brad Smith, who testified. I think the core issue is that the SolarWinds attack demonstrates and reinforces why we have to have greater illumination of the supply chain. And as you know, there have been some efforts in the DFARS to write this into contracts and have this illumination flow down. There have been some legal privity issues that have been put in opposition to this illumination. And the real reason the privity is put forward, because once you look at a whole supply chain, you begin to see, which we don't need to know, but you then understand the profit and loss of each part of the chain, and you actually get to see what the rate of returns and returns of investment are in each layer from 1 through down to 14 or 25. And what we're saying is that we need more. We don't need to know the cost of the issue. What you really need to know is who the suppliers are on subs, And in SolarWinds, one of the issues were they using software running outside of CONUS? Where we increasingly want to see what the provenance is of where the both hardware and software is coming from. And I think SolarWinds is gonna be a push for us to get more confidence. And then the second part of the answer is that once you're inside the code writing and it's part of the update, we have a tendency to think whenever you do the updates that we're okay. I mean, most of our listeners, I'm sure, have their platforms. They update their platforms pursuant to what the app requires, and you assume that that update is going to be legitimate and authorized. And if anyone gets into that chain of the update, that's what SolarWinds did. And I think what we're doing is we're looking at what are similar products of SolarWinds that have that branch of going across a number of silos, that if we wanted to infect malware into that because you get scale by doing it, I think we're starting to identify and look at those particular apps so that we can see what is a greater way to police when we say okay to the upgrade.
So you mentioned illuminating the supply chain, gaining visibility. I think that's one of the big challenges that we've seen, is just understanding who are the contributors, right? Understanding who they are. You mentioned contract privity. So maybe you could give a little more insight into what that privity concept does in terms of affecting our ability to see down into the supply chain, and how do we get past that? How do we see the details of our supply chain and the level of risk that's there?
I would say that I'll leap to the answer. There is clearly a statutory power that the government has, as the Defense Production Act. And, you know, a lot of people were asking the DPA to be activated in the context of COVID-19. And the last administration had been quite hesitant to do that. But the government does have the power to overcome the privity issue by either, one, locking in requirements in the DFARS contracting, or two, using the DPA, Defense Production Act. And then there's some legislation being mooted about whether or not this type of information should then be able to be consolidated in a third party, not the government maybe per se, but maybe quasi entities that would be then able to curate that information and start using algorithms to see what the potential risk factors are. So that is, I think, the way we may be going forward in time, as people realize that we want to sort of lock down our supply chains and gain confidence in them.
I mean, that's a pretty fundamental change in the game. So we had Microsoft on this town hall series last week, and they mentioned on there, which would surprise me, that they don't feel CMMC is required for their cloud service offerings. So in the sense of CMMC being, you know, sort of this idea that flows down, gets to all levels of the supply chain, Microsoft, who's, you know, at the bottom of a lot of our supply chains, maybe not the very bottom, but they're at in the foundation for many government contractors. They felt like it they didn't need to get certified based on their reading of the requirement. Now, they did mention that they're going to voluntarily evaluate their offerings against the CMMC standard, so it's not like they're trying to, you know, squirm out of it or something. But it does seem like CMMC as an initiative doesn't directly address these sort of foundational cloud offerings. I would say that's true for software vendors like SolarWinds as well.
Yeah.
Does CMMC help with this picture, or do we need other things? Is it a miss that needs to be addressed by other kind of initiatives?
Well, one of the issues is, one of the solutions that's being put forward, as you know, is in order for smaller companies to meet the CMMC standards and quickly get to level 3, would be them to go and use a cloud service that would be able to respond to the COI problems and control of documentation and data problems. So increasingly, if that becomes a solution, and many cloud providers are offering that as a way to get around and meet the standards, or I would say meet the standards. The issue also is, and we had FedRAMP, we have a variety of regulations, we have the NIST, we have the ISOs that people are talking as the standards. That may be a solution, but then as we've talked about, that would then create what I would refer to as a data Pearl Harbor situation, in which the large clouds are going to be extraordinarily attractive targets for adversaries, given the ability for them to get the access to the supply chain information. And then it's going to be a question about, which we don't have currently, but I see will be coming eventually, is standards for how you actually have to segment your networks. So how those networks in the clouds will be configured, and whether or not we will start setting criteria for that, so that if someone breaks in, they'll be in their box and will have a great difficulty going laterally, I think is the next level that a number of us are focusing on if the cloud becomes the solution. And then what the clouds, as you said, will be required to do to meet forms of regulations will be the next sort of round as we go through forward and produce data security.
I mean, there's no doubt that CMMC as an initiative is driving a lot of cloud adoption, right? It's an accelerator. And on the one hand, that's a good thing. I mean, you mentioned the Pearl Harbor scenario where you get a lot of intellectual property concentrated in maybe what is a fairly small number of providers, a small number of systems. But the flip side of that is that the cloud providers are able to do a much better job of securing their infrastructure than most of their customers are capable of doing on their own. So I guess my follow-up is, you know, using the cloud securely requires the customer to make smart choices. So even if the cloud providers do a fantastic job of protecting their infrastructure in ways, you know, beyond the level of defense that was capable, say in the Pearl Harbor scenario you mentioned, you still rely on the consumer to make smart choices in how they configure and how they use.
So you know, if you have the
that side of sort of the wholesale migration of DoD contractors into cloud computing.
So as you know, if you are going to do the Azure cloud, let's say take that example, there's a whole preset conditions you need to do in order for you to protect it, then get on the cloud. It's not a snap as I think the technologists in the audience will tell you. There's going to be a whole set of preconditions technologically that one needs to be able to assure. The second element I think that's happening, Ed, is we have quite an amazing framework that's confronting our these companies. There's CMMC, there's NIST, there's the GDPR, there's FedRAMP, there's SOX, there's HIPAA. I mean, the companies are confronting an amazing legislative legal framework to lock down data. And I think, as you know, as someone, I've advised companies, this requires a clear investment to be able to do it. So one of the issues that we've been looking at is, should there be, for companies that do this, forms of tax credits that they should be getting to do it? Well, should that mean if they take these steps, they should have lower cyber insurance premiums if they respond to regulation? I think Washington is going to have to get to be a little bit more creative to create more carrots and not just sticks in order for the small companies and large companies to flow down and lock down the requirements.
I think you're right. And the insurance carrot we've heard about on some events I've done recently with representatives from the insurance industry, that is, I think, happening today. I think those kind of carrots exist that you can, by doing things in a certain way, you can lower your premiums. The government initiated carrots, there's been a lot of talk about, but we haven't seen yet. Let me shift gears a little bit. I have an audience question I want to work in. Yeah. This one says, is there any chance we will see creation of a national supply chain intelligence center as described in DU?
Right. So as you know, I'm one of the authors of DU, Deliver Uncompromised. Mm-hmm. We have been, the NDAA has talked about whether or not it will help create one of these centers that was part of a recommendation from the Solarium project. The Solarium project has been very effective in getting their recommendations into the NDAA. And I think there's a growing awareness that the key to this, a whole of society response, is going to require this information that we can get flowed to a center. That center, I think, may have to be quasi-government, but in particular, what I think the practitioners and companies want, which I support, is that they would receive immunity for sharing the information, and that it wouldn't be used against them. It should be somewhat anonymized. And then we'll be able to see what the trends are for the adversary's attack and where the weaknesses are. And then we should be able to flow that information back to the people who are at the front lines and getting attacked. So I think that's the vision. And how many more solar winds do we need before the country as a whole says we have to create this form of information? As you know, the analogy we had used is the NCTC, the National Counterintelligence Center, which had a similar set of silos about flowing of information. And we have been able to overcome it. And we want a similar type of NCTC format. And I'm an optimist, and I'm keeping hope alive that will happen, and will be configured in a way that the private sector will find appropriate to share the information.
Very much like the concept of the kind of whole of society response. And I mean, this series has been really focused on the defense industrial base, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for the kind of things that are happening here to spread to in a much wider way, whether that's CMMC or something else. But I agree, we need to think about it in terms of entire national posture.
Yes, I take blame for this, because when we did DU, we knew that we had contractual leverage over the DIB. But in the end, this is a much greater problem, as we saw recently with the attack on the medical facility in Florida, for the attack that allowed them to manipulate what the actual balances were for the water. We have a key problem, and the core industries are the DIB, but it also is finance and electrical power and water. I would say those are the four key industries, of which the DIB is one, or the military is one.
And for anybody who's on the call who's not familiar with this report, it's called Deliver Uncompromised, and it's worth looking up if you haven't read it. It's really in many ways, Harvey, thanks for your contributions to it. It's really the genesis of all that we're talking about today with these current regulations.
Yes,
a lot of the elements supported or recommended first in that Deliver Uncompromised report.
Yeah, we see it as a stocking stuffer, or a Hanukkah gift you may want to give to people to read over the dinner table for conversation with the kids. And although I will tell you, I've been doing this for quite a while, and the first attack we ever saw was under the administration of Bill Clinton, and that was an attack on the military. And when I was currently at the FBI then. This has been going on now for 20 plus years that we've seen this, and only increasingly has it come to the forefront as a national security issue. It's quite fascinating. And I've written a textbook a number of years ago which was used in midst of the professional military education, called the National Security Enterprise. And I will admit to you, when we wrote it in 2017 or so, there was no discussion of supply chain. We had not seen the supply chain as being one of the national security focal points. And we had been focusing on defense platforms, but I think COVID-19 has demonstrated why the supply chain issue across a number of silos is critical for us to protect ourselves.
Agreed. Let me shift to the human element, really a critical part of a lot of attack scenarios. So if you look at the way successful attacks are happening, there's almost always some failure on the human side as part of that attack chain. I've heard you speak about a shift from insider threat to insider risk. What's behind that change in focus, or that?
Yeah, so I affectionately refer to people as carbon units, and what we have found is, do a thought experiment. Let's say we lock down all of the supply chain and the software, and we locked down all of our hardware. So we were very comfortable in your facilities, both the software and hardware would not be able to be compromised coming out of the shop and integrated in the OT specs. But if we had Ed Bassett there, and we were able to flip Ed Bassett to become an adversary or an agent of a foreign power.
That's not a thing.
I understand, but let's say I could offer you $2 or $3 million, maybe
Mike,
$5
that's very white.
maybe 10 million. And I just gave you an ability, and I knew that you could access your network. And with that access to the network, you would be able to inject malware or put in 0 days into your system. And for exfiltration, we would have a problem. So even if we're incredibly successful on the technology side, the carbon unit side is, and the reason we expanded this from, usually when you think of the insider threat, that usually is tied to espionage. That's what we did for the insider threat. I was involved in helping to establish that executive order, and when I was working at the National Counterintelligence Executive with Bear Bryant. But we began to realize when I started getting broader and dealing with the private sector, they're concerned with, they said, Harvey, we're concerned, I understand you guys are concerned about the espionage problem, SolarWinds, but we're also concerned about workplace violence. We've had an increase in workplace violence. And we think, is there a personality type that would be both willing to become an agent of a foreign power and become violent in our workplace? And we thought, oh, that's a very interesting question. How do we use social psychology? And what we're now referring to, the phrase I will give you at Arliss that we use, cognitive security, which is the final battleground, which in your case, Ed, is the 8 inches between your ears. For many, it's 6, but for you, it's 8. And what is it that psychologically you respond to messages that would either get you in a situation in which you would think of violence and or you might think of espionage. And we're trying to get a more scientific social psychology approach at Arliss to start thinking about how can we start doing tests, evaluating what's the information that you would find the most persuasive. If I put a cat on an email to you or a kitten, will you click on that particular email? If there's some hockey players in the audience, if I do a Gordie Howe retrospect email, will you click on that? So what is it about you that makes you particularly susceptible to certain types of information is what we're trying to think through. And the broader element of this, of course, is fake news and the political system we're in. It's a real continuum about what it is about making individuals process information and then act on it, is what we're trying to think about and look at. And we're looking at, there seems to be a lot more correlations than there is causality in this space. And there's, if you know, the continuing monitoring and maintenance of workforces 2.0 is a component of the CMMC issue, which is technology. And the continuing monitoring is more the carbon unit issue, but they're a continuum and tied together.
So if you look at the state of things today, companies typically don't have a lot of insight into the details of the employee activity on their information systems, right? So even if they're keeping logs and tracing activity back in case of an investigation where they could say, okay, now that I'm looking, I can see that this employee did these things at this time. Even if they have that data, most are not proactively monitoring it in any way that would let them detect an insider risk in a proactive way. So our ability to detect that kind of threat that you're talking about is a lot less mature than our ability to detect, say, malware, other actions that are typically an external threat. Do you see that changing? I mean, are we shifting more towards not just logging, but actually looking for those red flags you mentioned, those things that might be an indicator that something is either going wrong or going to go wrong in the future?
So in a democracy, this is, I think, one of the great challenges of the 21st century, because the Chinese have gone way down on this path of trying to use data and information, using everything from how many parking tickets you have to how early or late you are on your paying of mortgages, and they create a citizen score. And depending on the score you get, you may get reduced rates for tickets on trains or planes if you're a good citizen and have a certain score. The same way we have FICO scores, they're creating a citizen score about risk factors about the individual. And so we're a democracy, but as we move into exploiting social media data and exploiting artificial intelligence and machine learning, just think of the information or ads you get on your cell phone predicated on the social media's analysis of your likes and dislikes, and how they start to move you down a certain path of activity or consumption. That unfortunately is one of the challenges of the 21st century. And the irony is one of the issues confronting the intelligence community is there's some questions, can they buy certain types of data, informational data, that a private company can, that gives all sorts of interesting issues like location data, and factor that into a variety of a person map about you that starts giving the capacity to know a whole range of your likes and dislikes, where you are and where you're going on almost a minute-to-minute basis. As you know, this machine gives off your location of where you are constantly. So I think, Ed, this is a real challenge. The government is a little bit behind in, I'd say, weaponizing and exploiting this information, but the private sector is far in advance of understanding how to exploit the data. And unfortunately, authoritarian regimes are even spending more money to be able to get this access to this technology. So this is why CMMC is just the beginning of the toe of us trying to figure out how to lock down these issue of your cyber networks.
So let me swing this back to CMMC a little bit.
Yeah.
I've got just one more question, and then I've got an audience question I want to work in, and then we'll wrap up. We've talked about a lot of risks today. These are challenging risks that seem maybe intractable in some ways, certainly more challenging than I think we may have realized. In the context of a typical government contractor trying to decide what actions to take, CMMC has gotten people's attention. They're thinking about it. They're working very hard on it from a compliance perspective. What are your suggestions on things people should be doing right now today, either as part of their compliance effort or as a way to go beyond that and address some of these risks we're talking about? If they want to do the right thing, what is that, and how do they know what is the right thing? How do they know what they should be spending their time, their money on right now?
Right. So I would say that for people who want to play, there are three general areas. One is documentation. What is the documentation of your systems? What are your procedures? What's your system security plan? What's your plan of action? What's your compliance guidance that you have? What have you demonstrated as a documentation so someone can see what your plans are going forward? I think when you go when the boards come in for the accreditation boards, that documentation issue is going to be an important aspect. A second is, what is your security and compliance program? What exactly have you done to be able to test under NIST 800-171 and the CMMC standards that you've hit the levels of level 3? Because I think level 3 is going to be one of the more common elements. So that's the second issue. And then the third is, what has been your remuneration plan? What have been your technical solutions for the classic CUI problem, how you interact with the FCI issues, how you're dealing with your contractors? What is the mechanism and what have you done to demonstrate technologically that you are tracking and have solutions that are required? Because we're starting this journey with level 3 being sort of the opening bid. You can always just say you don't want to play, you just don't want to deal with the government. But I think eventually consumers are going to be asking, what actually is your network security if we're interacting with you, and your clients will start be asking this question. The same way we've seen in the banking and financial community that's ratcheted up the ability to play unless you can demonstrate, but they've also been regulated by a different set of financial regs like the SEC and a variety of other regulatory bodies. But we're moving in that direction, Ed. I think that's why I advise people to have those three elements that they want to do it, because you have to proactively secure your data. You're going to have to implement some compliance objectives. You're going to have to fix your deficiencies and prepare for a CMMC contract. And if you don't, and you don't do anything, and you lose data, this will break your contracts. If that helps.
I appreciate you mentioned that in the context of, you know, the ongoing security program and the necessity of doing it in that context, because writing documentation by itself sitting on the shelf doesn't do any good, right? So since I'm in the SecOps, the security operations business, the ongoing operation of that, taking those documents and making them part of your everyday life,
I'll give you that.
Measured by CMMC, right? The maturity level is about how these things are institutionalized. So
I'll give you an example. I was sitting on a board, and we had separated our IT component from the parent company, because it was as part of a CFIUS sort of obligation. And the IT people came to me, they were reporting to me on the board, and they said, we've separated, we're good. And then about 6 months later, I had the CIO come to me and the CISO, and they had lost blood in their face. I said, what's going on? And they said, we just found that in our separated network, we had a beacon signaling back to the mothership because it was signaling that we had to renew our contracts license for a Microsoft app. And it was so buried deep into the app that it still had that ability to beacon back to the mothership where it came from, even though we thought it had been physically and technically separated. And I said, well, that's a good news story, because we're going to go to our regulators and say, we just found this and we're fixing it. But I'm willing to bet there are many, many companies that are going to have a similar issue. And the question you should be asking is, do you have this particular application? And if they come to you to tell you there's a beacon signaling, because they're embedded in all the apps. So that to me is when we start having a better relationship, is that we can come forward with the problem and you're not penalized, you're rewarding.
Good point. So quick audience question, and then I'll wrap things up. This is a question about threat intelligence sharing. Is mostly done with the supply chain via email today. CISA sends out alerts, et cetera. Yeah. The question is, are you aware of the government putting any focus on actionable or automated information sharing that can be ingested directly into, you know, SIM platforms?
Yeah.
So that we can just bring this stuff in a more automated way.
I would tell, the questioner is absolutely correct, because if we want to scale this, so I will tell you that there are programs in which we're experimenting with potential sensors that sit outside the network, and some, if you feel comfortable, inside the network, that will be monitoring exfiltration issues from the network, and also monitoring internal aberrations of data flowing where it shouldn't flow. And we're going to have to use AI and ML eventually to do this, but we do have some experimental programs. And the question is, that information flow has to go to another collection platform that will be able, in real time, start analyzing the data to see whether or not there's anomalies in that exfiltration issue. So one of the interesting questions about SolarWinds is, why was there no analysis of the exfiltration of the data? How did they hide the signal with the noise that people did not figure out that there was something going on there? Is a great technical issue that I hope in time we will start having technical solutions. And that is the only way this is going to happen en masse and on scale. So I agree with the caller.
Harvey, thanks very much. And thanks to you for taking time today to share some of these insights with us. Thanks to the audience. I hope you found it fascinating. I certainly did. I would suggest you could join our future town hall series. We're going to be doing this every week. We have been doing it since May, and it's been going very well. We've had some very interesting perspectives on CMMC and other related cyber risks. Our next session is going to be Wednesday, March 3rd at 1 p.m. Eastern, our regular time. If you don't have that on your calendar or have an invite, please visit our website at neosystemscorp.com for the details. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you, NeoSystems, for being so helpful in putting these issues out into the public for discussion. Great job.
Thank you, Harvey.